The crowd fell silent as she stepped onto the platform. Dirt streaked her face, her wild auburn hair tangled with leaves, and her eyes blazed with a fury that made grown men step back. They called her untamable, worthless, a lost cause. But Marcus Whitfield saw something else entirely, something that would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of September 15th dawned gray and bitter over Millbrook County. Marcus Whitfield adjusted his leather jacket as he walked through the muddy grounds of the Riverside auction house, his boots squelching with each step. At 28, he'd built a reputation as one of the most successful horse trainers in 3 states. But today he wasn't here for horses. The annual county auction was notorious for its human trafficking, disguised as employment contracts, a practice that made Marcus's stomach turn. He'd attended for one reason only. His younger sister Emma had begged him to rescue someone, anyone, from the degrading spectacle. Emma, always the bleeding heart, had heard whispers about a particular girl who'd been causing trouble for weeks. "She's been through 7 different handlers already," Emma had told him over breakfast that morning. "They say she's impossible, Marcus. Completely wild. No one wants her." Marcus had initially refused. He had enough complications in his life without taking on a damaged human being who would likely run away at the first opportunity. His ranch, Ironwood Stables, demanded every ounce of his attention. The 50-acre property nestled in the Appalachian foothills had been his grandfather's dream and his father's legacy. After losing both men in a car accident 3 years prior, Marcus had thrown himself into maintaining their vision of breeding the finest quarter horses in Virginia. But Emma's pleading eyes had worn him down, just as they always did. The auction house buzzed with the usual crowd of unsavory characters. Wealthy landowners looking for cheap labor, factory foremen seeking desperate workers, and worse, men whose intentions Marcus preferred not to contemplate. He recognized several faces from previous auctions, their expressions ranging from bored indifference to predatory anticipation. Ezra Blackwood held court near the registration table, his silver hair slicked back and his expensive suit a stark contrast to the grimy surroundings. At 62, Blackwood owned half the county's manufacturing plants and had a reputation for working his contracted employees to the bone. His laugh boomed across the courtyard as he regaled his associates with stories of previous acquisitions. "Remember that brunette from last spring?" Blackwood's voice carried, despite Marcus's attempts to avoid eavesdropping. "Thought she was so clever, trying to organize the other workers. Took exactly 2 weeks to break that spirit of hers." Marcus's jaw tightened. He'd heard similar stories about Blackwood's methods: isolation, impossible quotas, threats against family members. The man operated just within legal boundaries while creating his own private hell for anyone unfortunate. Enough to fall under his control. Sheriff Coleman Hayes stood nearby, his badge catching the weak sunlight. At 45, Hayes had held his position for over a decade, maintaining order through a combination of willful blindness and selective enforcement. Everyone knew he received generous donations from men like Blackwood, ensuring that complaints about working conditions rarely resulted in investigations. "Gentlemen," Hayes announced, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur, "will be starting in 10 minutes. Today's offerings include 12 individuals of various ages and skill levels. As always, all contracts are binding for a minimum of 2 years, with extensions available at the owner's discretion." Marcus felt his disgust deepen. The clinical language couldn't disguise what this really was: human slavery wrapped in legal technicalities. The contracts were notoriously one-sided, trapping desperate people in situations they couldn't escape without facing imprisonment for breach of contract. The first 11 individuals were paraded across the platform with depressing efficiency. A middle-aged man whose gambling debts had cost him everything. A young mother whose medical bills had forced her into this nightmare. Each story was a tragedy, each sale a wound to Marcus's conscience. He bid half-heartedly on a few, but Blackwood and his associates outbid him every time with casual indifference. Then came number 12. The crowd's restless chatter died as she emerged from the holding area. Caitlin Ray Morrison stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, but her presence filled the entire courtyard. Her auburn hair hung in waves past her shoulders, tangled with bits of hay and what looked like thorns. Dirt streaked her pale skin, and her clothes, a torn denim jacket over a faded t-shirt and jeans, hung loose on her slight frame, but it was her eyes that captured everyone's attention. Green as bottle glass and burning with an intensity that made several men unconsciously step backward. She surveyed the crowd with unconcealed contempt, her chin raised in defiance despite the chains around her wrists. Lot number 12, the auctioneer announced, consulting his paperwork with obvious reluctance. Caitlin Morrison, age 23. Previously employed in various capacities. Current contract holder reports difficulties with compliance and cooperation. A ripple of nervous laughter swept through the crowd. Marcus noticed how the guards flanking Caitlin maintained careful distance, as if afraid she might lunge at them. Despite her restraints, what kind of difficulties? Called out Jeremiah Thorne, a factory owner known for his preference for young female workers. His question carried an undertone that made Marcus's hands clench into fists. The auctioneer cleared his throat uncomfortably. The subject has proven resistant to authority. Multiple incidents of insubordination, attempted escapes, and physical altercations with supervisors. Previous contract holder is eager to transfer ownership immediately. More laughter, but Marcus noticed the uncertainty beneath it. These men were bullies accustomed to easy victims. Caitlin Morrison was clearly something else entirely. Starting bid is $50, the auctioneer continued. Due to the subject's behavioral issues, we're beginning unusually low. The insult hung in the air like a slap. $50 less than the cost of a decent saddle. Marcus watched Caitlin's reaction, expecting to see shame or despair. Instead, her lips curved into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. The expression sent a chill down his spine and made him wonder what kind of fire burned behind those green eyes. $50, Thorne called out lazily. Might be worth it for the entertainment value alone. His comment drew knowing chuckles from his companions. Marcus felt his protective instincts surge, remembering Emma's words about rescue and redemption. But this wasn't some helpless victim waiting for salvation. Caitlin Morrison looked like she could burn down the entire auction house with her bare hands if given the chance. 60, another voice called. 75. The bidding proceeded slowly, hampered by obvious reluctance. These men wanted easy prey, not a wildcat who might claw their faces off. Marcus found himself studying Caitlin more closely, trying to understand what he was seeing. Her posture spoke of coiled strength despite her slight build. Her movements, even restricted by chains, held a fluidity that reminded him of his best horse whose powerful predators barely contained. Most intriguing. Her eyes never stopped moving, cataloging faces, exits, weapons, opportunities. This wasn't broken desperation. This was tactical assessment. 150. Blackwood finally entered the bidding, his tone bored. Let's move this along. The crowd fell silent. Blackwood's involvement changed the dynamic entirely. His resources were virtually unlimited, and his reputation ensured that few people dared compete with him directly. Marcus watched as potential bidders reconsidered, unwilling to anger a man who controlled so much of the local economy. But Marcus also noticed something else, a flicker of genuine fear in Caitlin's eyes when she looked at Blackwood. For the first time since emerging onto the platform, her mask of defiance wavered slightly. Whatever she'd endured before, the prospect of falling under Blackwood's control clearly terrified her. Going once at 150, the auctioneer called. Marcus's mouth opened before his brain caught up. 200. Every head turned toward him. He felt the weight of dozens of stares, ranging from curious to hostile. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he studied Marcus with new interest. "Well, well," Blackwood murmured, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Marcus Whitfield enters the fray. "Tell me, son, what use would a horse trainer have for such a troublesome acquisition?" The question held multiple layers of threat and inquiry. Marcus forced himself to remain calm, knowing that showing weakness now would only make things worse. "Same use anyone has for good help, I suppose." "Good help?" Blackwood's laugh held no humor. "Boy, you clearly haven't done your research. This particular item has put 3 men in the hospital and caused over $2,000 in property damage. She's not help, she's a liability." "250, Marcus replied instead of taking the bait. A murmur ran through the crowd. This was more money than anyone had expected for such a problematic purchase. Marcus caught Caitlin staring at him with an unreadable expression. Her head tilted slightly as if trying to solve a puzzle. Blackwood's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 300, 400, 500. The bidding war had begun in earnest now. Marcus felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. $500 was a significant sum for his current budget, but something about this girl called to him in ways he couldn't explain. Maybe it was her obvious spirit, so different from the broken souls usually paraded across this platform. Maybe it was the way she'd looked at Blackwood with such clear-eyed hatred. Or maybe Emma's words about rescue had taken deeper root then. He'd realized. 600, Blackwood countered, his tone sharpening. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus hesitated. 600 would strain his finances seriously, potentially forcing him to delay some necessary improvements to the ranch. But the alternative, leaving Caitlin to Blackwood's tender mercies, seemed impossible now. 700. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. This was unprecedented territory for such an auction. Even the auctioneer looked surprised, consulting his paperwork as if to confirm he'd heard correctly. Blackwood's face darkened. 800. 1,000. The words left Marcus's mouth before he could stop them. $1,000 more than he'd paid for his last 2 horses combined. The crowd fell completely silent, stunned by the astronomical sum. Blackwood stared at Marcus for a long moment, his expression calculating. Then his lips curved into a cold smile. "Interesting," he murmured. "Very interesting indeed." For several heartbeats, the entire auction house held its breath. Then Blackwood shrugged with apparent indifference. "She's all yours, Whitfield. I hope you know what you're buying." The auctioneer's gavel fell with finality. "Sold to Marcus Whitfield for $1,000. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with speculation about the unprecedented sale, Marcus found himself wondering the same thing. What exactly had he just bought? And more importantly, what was he going to do with her? Caitlin Morrison continued to stare at him from the platform, her green eyes unreadable. But for just a moment, Marcus thought he saw something that hadn't been there before, a flicker of curiosity that matched his own. The paperwork took 30 minutes to complete. Sheriff Hayes handled the transaction with professional efficiency, though Marcus caught him glancing repeatedly between Marcus and Caitlin with obvious concern. "You sure about this, Marcus?" Hayes asked quietly as they finalized the contract transfer. "Girl's got a reputation for causing trouble. Might be more than you bargained for." "I'll manage," Marcus replied, signing the final document with hands that trembled slightly. "Your funeral," Hayes shrugged. "Contract's binding for 2 years minimum, remember. Can't just change your mind if things get difficult." Marcus nodded, his attention drawn to where Caitlin waited under guard near the loading area. She hadn't spoken a word since the auction ended, But her eyes tracked his every movement with predatory focus. As he approached to collect his purchase, Marcus realized that his life had just taken a turn into completely uncharted territory. Emma had asked him to rescue someone, but looking at Caitlin Morrison's fierce, unbroken spirit, he began to suspect that she might be the one doing the rescuing. The question was, rescuing him from what? The ride to Ironwood Stables stretched 43 miles through winding mountain roads, and Caitlin Morrison hadn't spoken a single word since they'd left the auction house. She sat in the passenger seat of Marcus's Ford pickup truck, her handcuffs removed but her posture rigid as steel. Her green eyes remained fixed on the landscape rushing past the window, as if memorizing every landmark for future reference. Marcus glanced at her periodically, unsure how to break the suffocating silence. The radio played softly classic country. That usually calmed his nerves, but today even Hank Williams couldn't ease the tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. "You hungry?" he finally ventured as they passed through the small town of Cedar Falls. "There's a decent diner here if you want to stop." Caitlin's head turned toward him slowly, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Marcus thought she might actually respond. Then she faced the window again without a word, dismissing him as thoroughly as if he didn't exist. The rejection stung more than it should have. Marcus had rescued countless horses from bad situations, and they'd never made him feel this uncertain. But horses communicate in ways he understood: body language, nickering, the way they held their ears. Caitlin Morrison was a puzzle written in a language he'd never learned to read. They continued through Cedar Falls in silence, past the weathered storefronts and the handful of locals who waved at Marcus's familiar truck. Mrs. Henderson from the general store paused in sweeping her front steps to peer curiously at his passenger. Marcus could already imagine the phone calls that would follow. News traveled fast in small mountain communities, and his expensive auction purchase would be the talk of 3 counties by nightfall. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the road narrowed and the trees pressed closer. Ancient oaks and maples formed a canopy overhead, filtering the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns across the asphalt. This was Marcus's favorite part of the drive home, the moment when civilization fell away and the wild heart of Appalachia revealed itself. "Beautiful country," he murmured, more to himself than to his silent passenger. This time, Caitlin's response was immediate and sharp. "Beautiful prison." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. 2 simple words, but they carried such weight of bitterness and loss that he found himself pulling the truck onto a scenic overlook without conscious thought. The engine ticked as it cooled, the only sound breaking the mountain silence below them. The valley spread like a green carpet punctuated by the silver thread of Willow Creek. In the distance, the Blue Ridge Mountains rolled away to the horizon, their peaks softened by afternoon haze. Marcus had grown up with this view, had proposed to his college girlfriend Sarah at this very spot 7 years ago. To him, it represented everything good about home. But to Caitlin, apparently, it meant something entirely different. "You see prison bars where I see freedom," Marcus said carefully. "That's interesting." Caitlin turned to study him with those penetrating green eyes. "Freedom?" Her laugh held no humor. "You paid $1,000 for me. How exactly does that translate to freedom?" The directness of her question caught Marcus off guard. He'd expected sullen silence or perhaps explosive anger, not this calm, logical challenge to his actions. "The contract gives you employment, room and board, fair wages." "The contract makes me your property for 2 years, Caitlin interrupted. "Call it whatever pretty name you want, but we both know what this really is." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I'm not like those other men. I brought you to get you away from them, especially Blackwood. You should be grateful." "Grateful?" The word cracked like a whip. Caitlin's composure finally slipped, revealing the fury that burned beneath her controlled surface. "You want me to be grateful that you bought me like a piece of livestock?" That you decided my fate without asking what I wanted. What you wanted, Marcus shot back, his own temper flaring. You were about to be sold to a man who breaks people for sport. I saved you from that, did you? Caitlin's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt more dangerous than shouting. Or did you just decide that your cage would be prettier than his? The accusation hung between them like a slap. Marcus stared at her, seeing himself reflected in her eyes and not liking what he found there. Had he really been motivated by altruism? Or had there been something else driving his bidding war with Blackwood? Something possessive and primal that he didn't want to examine too closely? I'm not keeping you in a cage, he said finally. Prove it. Caitlin leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his face. Let me out of this truck right now. Let me walk away, and don't follow me. If you're really my savior instead of my owner, prove it. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The challenge was impossible, and they both knew it. Even if he was willing to let her go, which every protective instinct screamed against, the legal contract bound them both. If she ran and was caught, they'd both face serious consequences. You know I can't do that, he admitted. Then stop pretending this is about my welfare. Caitlin settled back into her seat, her brief moment of fire banking into cold embers. At least be honest about what you've done. The words stung because they contained a grain of truth Marcus didn't want to acknowledge. Yes, he'd been horrified by the thought of Blackwood getting his hands on her. But there had been something else in that moment when he'd seen her on the platform, something that had nothing to do with altruism and everything to do with the way she'd looked like a wild creature that belonged in the mountains, not in some factory or worse. They drove the remaining 20 minutes to Ironwood Stables in heavy silence. Marcus found himself stealing glances at Caitlin as the familiar landmarks came into view. The old stone bridge his grandfather had built by hand, the meadow where he'd learned to ride, the weathered barn that had sheltered 4 generations of Whitfield horses. As they turned into the long gravel driveway lined with split-rail fencing, Marcus felt a familiar pride well up in his chest. Ironwood Stables wasn't the biggest operation in Virginia, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. The main house sat on a low rise overlooking the barn and pastures, its log construction and wide porches blending seamlessly with the mountain landscape. Below, the barn complex spread across 5 acres of level ground, with paddocks and training rings carefully positioned to take advantage of the natural terrain. Caitlin's first sight of the horses grazing in the main pasture brought the first change in her expression since they'd left the overlook. Her eyes softened almost imperceptibly as she watched a magnificent chestnut stallion raise his head to study the approaching truck. The horse's coat gleamed like polished copper in the late afternoon sun, and his intelligent dark eyes held a wildness that seemed to recognize something in Caitlin. That's Thunder Canyon, Marcus said, following her gaze. My grandfather's bloodline. 3 generations of champion quarter horses. For a moment, Caitlin seemed to forget her anger. He's beautiful, she murmured, her voice holding a note Marcus hadn't heard before. Wonder, perhaps, or recognition. Thunder Canyon whinnied softly and trotted along the fence line, keeping pace with the truck as they drove toward the barn. Other horses in the pasture lifted their heads to watch, their curiosity evident in their alert postures and pricked ears. They're welcoming you, Marcus observed, surprised by the horse's unusual behavior. Normally, his animals were more reserved. With strangers, Caitlin didn't respond, but Marcus caught her studying the horses with the same tactical awareness she'd shown at the auction. Her eyes tracked the layout of the paddocks, the spacing of the fence posts, the distance to the tree line. Even in her apparent fascination with the animals, she was cataloging escape routes. The truck crunched to a stop in front of the main barn, a massive structure built from chestnut logs and fieldstone. The building had weathered nearly a century of mountain winters, its timbers darkened with age but still solid as bedrock. Marcus felt a familiar surge of gratitude for his grandfather's craftsmanship. and his father's careful maintenance. As they climbed out of the truck, Emma emerged from the barn leading a young mare. Marcus's sister looked exactly like their mother. Had at 25, petite and blonde with bright blue eyes that missed nothing. She moved with the easy confidence of someone who'd grown up around horses. But Marcus noticed how her steps faltered when she got her first clear look at Caitlin. "This is Emma, my sister," Marcus said, making introductions that felt oddly formal given the circumstances. "Emma, meet Caitlin Morrison." Emma approached slowly, her expression mixing curiosity with concern. "Hello, Caitlin. Welcome to Ironwood." Caitlin studied Emma with the same intensity she'd shown everything else, but her posture relaxed slightly. Perhaps she sensed that Emma posed no threat, or maybe the presence of another woman provided some small comfort. "Thank you, Caitlin," said simply the first polite words she'd spoken since leaving the auction. Emma's eyes widened slightly at the sound of Caitlin's voice. Marcus realized his sister had probably been expecting someone broken or subdued, not this poised young woman who radiated controlled strength. "I've prepared the guest room in the main house," Emma said, addressing both of them. "I thought that would be more comfortable than the quarters above the barn." "That's not necessary," Caitlin said quickly. "I don't need special treatment." "It's not special treatment," Marcus replied. "It's human decency." The words came out harsher than he'd intended, highlighting the tension that still crackled between them. Emma glanced between her brother and their new arrival, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. "Why don't I show you around?" Emma suggested diplomatically. "You can get a feel for the place, meet some of the horses." Caitlin hesitated, then nodded. As they walked toward the barn, Marcus hung back, watching the interaction between the two women. Emma chatted easily about the horses, the property, and her brother's work as a trainer. Caitlin listened without contributing much, but Marcus noticed how her attention sharpened whenever Emma mentioned the animals. Inside the barn, the familiar sense of hay, leather, and horses created an atmosphere of warmth and comfort. 24 stalls lined the main aisle, most of them occupied by horses that represented Marcus's life's work. Each animal was a carefully chosen piece of his breeding program, selected for intelligence, athleticism, and temperament. But it was the horses' reaction to Caitlin that truly surprised Marcus. As they walked down the aisle, horse after horse came to their stall doors to watch her pass. Ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring to catch her scent, they displayed a level of interest that bordered on excitement. "They like you," Emma observed, with obvious surprise. "That's unusual. Most of them are pretty reserved with strangers." Caitlin paused in front of a stall containing a young gray mare named Moonlight. The horse stretched her neck over the door, nickering softly and clearly, inviting contact. Without hesitation, Caitlin reached up to stroke the mare's face, her movements showing the familiarity with horses that spoke of experience. "You've worked with horses before," Marcus said, making it a statement rather than a question. Caitlin's hand stilled on Moonlight's neck. "A long time ago." "Where?" For a moment, Marcus thought she might actually answer. Her guard seemed to drop as Moonlight nuzzled her palm, seeking treats. But then the shutters came down again, and Caitlin stepped away from the stall. "It doesn't matter," she said flatly. But it did matter, Marcus realized. Whatever her history with horses, it was clearly significant. The animals sensed something in her that humans missed, a connection that transcended words or circumstances. As they continued the tour, visiting the tack room, the feed storage, and the training areas, Marcus found himself reevaluating his impulsive purchase. He'd thought he was rescuing a victim, but Caitlin Morrison was clearly much more complex than that. She moved through his world with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Despite her circumstances, the sun was setting behind the mountains by the time they finished the tour, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Emma excused herself to start dinner, leaving Marcus and Caitlin alone in the gathering twilight. "The horses trust you," Marcus said as they stood watching Thunder Canyon and his companions settle for the night. "That's not something you can fake." Caitlin wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. "Animals are honest," she replied. "They don't pretend to be something they're not." The implication hung between them that humans, by contrast, were creatures of deception and hidden motives. Marcus wanted to protest, to defend his actions and intentions. But standing there in the growing darkness, watching this enigmatic woman who'd turned his carefully ordered world upside down in the span of a single day, he wondered if maybe she was right, thought maybe he'd been lying to himself about his motivations. Maybe the cage he'd built was just prettier than the others, but a cage nonetheless. The question was, what was he going to do about it? Marcus woke at 5:30, same as every morning for the past decade. The habit was so ingrained that he rarely needed an alarm clock. His body simply knew when the mountains began their daily transformation from shadow to gold. But this morning felt different. The house held a tension that hadn't existed yesterday, a subtle shift in the familiar rhythms that made him pause at the edge of his bed. Caitlin Morrison was somewhere under his roof, and that changed everything. He, dressed quietly in worn jeans and a flannel shirt, his movements automatic despite the unusual circumstances. Through his bedroom window, he could see the barn lights already glowing in the pre-dawn darkness. Old habits die hard, and morning chores wait for no one, not even moral crises about the nature of freedom and ownership. The hallway outside the guest room was silent. Marcus found himself slowing as he passed the closed door, wondering if Caitlin had slept at all. Emma had mentioned that their unexpected guest had barely touched the dinner of pot roast and vegetables, picking at her food with the wariness of someone unused to kindness without strings attached. Downstairs, Emma was already in the kitchen, her blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail as she prepared the first pot of coffee. She looked up as Marcus entered, her expression mixing concern with curiosity. "Any word from our guest?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice low. Emma shook her head. "Haven't heard a sound since she went upstairs around 9. Think she actually slept?" Marcus poured himself coffee from the pot, savoring the familiar ritual even as his mind churned with questions. "Hard to say. She's not exactly forthcoming about her needs." "Can you blame her?" Emma's tone held a gentle reproach. "Marcus, what were you thinking yesterday? $1,000 for someone you'd never met, with no idea what you were getting into?" It was a fair question, one that had kept Marcus awake far longer than usual. In the harsh light of dawn, his impulsive auction purchase seemed even more reckless than it had 24 hours ago. But every time he tried to regret the decision, he remembered the fear that had flickered in Caitlin's eyes when she'd looked at Ezra Blackwood. "I was thinking she needed help," he said finally. "And now?" Marcus sipped his coffee, buying time to formulate an answer. "Now I'm thinking it's more complicated than that." Emma studied her brother's face with the insight that came from 25 years of shared history. "You're attracted to her." The accusation hit like a cold slap. Marcus nearly choked on his coffee, heat flooding his cheeks. "Emma, it's not what?" Emma interrupted. "Marcus, I saw how you looked at her yesterday. And I saw how the horses reacted to her. That's not a coincidence." Before Marcus could formulate a denial, footsteps on the stairs announced Caitlin's approach. Both siblings fell silent, suddenly aware of how their conversation might sound to someone already suspicious of their motives. Caitlin appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing the same clothes from yesterday, her auburn hair pulled back in a simple braid that revealed the elegant line of her neck. Sleep had softened some of the hard edges in her expression, but her green eyes remained alert and watchful. "Morning," Emma said with determined cheerfulness. "Coffee's fresh, and I was just about to start breakfast. How do you like your eggs?" "I don't eat breakfast," Caitlin replied simply. Emma blinked in surprise. "Ever? Not much point when you don't know where your next meal is coming from." The words were delivered without self-pity, simply a statement of fact, but they hit both Whitfield's siblings like a physical blow. Marcus felt something twist in his chest. How long had Caitlin been living that way? How many mornings had she woken up with no certainty about food, shelter, or safety? The auction house had been her most recent stop, but what path had led her there? "Well, you know where your next meal is coming from now," Emma said firmly. "So sit down and let me make you eggs." For a moment, Caitlin seemed ready to argue. Then, something in Emma's expression, perhaps the simple kindness that had no agenda behind it, made her nod and take a seat at the kitchen table. As Emma bustled around the kitchen, Marcus found himself studying Caitlin in the morning light streaming through the windows. Yesterday's grime was gone, washed away to reveal features that were both delicate and strong. Her cheekbones were sharp with hunger, but her jawline spoke of determination that wouldn't bend easily. "You're staring," Caitlin observed without. Looking up from her coffee. Marcus felt heat climb his neck again. "Sorry, I was just wondering about your experience with horses. What about it? They liked you yesterday." "That's unusual for my animals." Caitlin's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her coffee mug. Maybe they recognize a fellow prisoner. The barb hit its mark, but Marcus pressed on. "Where did you learn to handle them?" For several heartbeats, Caitlin said nothing. Emma placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her, the domestic scene at odds with the tension crackling between Marcus and their guest. "My grandfather had a farm," Caitlin said finally, her voice carefully neutral, "before he died." "What kind of farm?" "The kind that gets sold to pay debts when the owner passes away." Marcus heard Emma's sharp intake of breath. The pieces of Caitlin's story were beginning to form a picture, a young woman who'd lost everything, possibly her only family, and somehow ended up in the system that led to auction houses and employment contracts. "How old were you?" Emma asked gently. 17. Caitlin took a small bite of eggs, her movements mechanical. "Old enough to be on my own, according to the state. Not old enough to inherit property that hadn't been paid for." The casual way she delivered this information somehow made it more heartbreaking. Marcus could imagine 17-year-old Caitlin losing her home, her family's legacy, and the horses that had clearly meant everything to her. It explained her wariness, her fierce independence, and her ability to read situations with tactical precision. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. Caitlin's laugh held no humor. "Everyone's sorry. Doesn't change anything." "No, but it matters. Does it?" Caitlin set down her fork and fixed him with those penetrating green eyes. "You're sorry about my past, but you still own my future. How exactly does that work?" Emma cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Why don't we talk about today instead?" "Marcus, don't you have horses to train?" Marcus nodded, grateful for the distraction. "3 young colts that need to start groundwork. Plus Thunder Canyon's been favoring his left front leg. Want to have the vet take a look?" "I could help," Caitlin said suddenly. Both siblings stared at her in surprise. It was the first time she'd volunteered for anything since arriving. "You don't have to," Marcus said carefully. "The contract doesn't specify what kind of work." "I know horses," Caitlin interrupted. "If that's what you do here, I might as well be useful." There was something in her tone that made Marcus study her more closely. Was this genuine interest or strategy? Did she see working with the horses as a way to earn trust, plan an escape, or simply find purpose in an impossible situation? "All right," he said finally, "but we start slow. I need to see what you can do." 20 minutes later, they stood in the main paddock as Marcus brought out the first of the young colts. Storm's Edge was a 2-year-old bay with his sire's intelligent eyes and his dam's nervous energy. The colt had been halter broken, but still needed work on basic ground manners and trust. Marcus clipped a lead rope to Storm's Edge's halter and led him into the paddock, speaking in the low, soothing tones that usually calmed anxious horses. But today, The colt seemed more agitated than usual, tossing his head and dancing sideways, as if sensing the tension between the humans. "He's picking up on your emotions," Caitlin observed, standing well back from the action. "You're nervous. About something." Marcus paused, recognizing the truth in her words. He was nervous about her, about the situation, about what would happen if she proved to be as gifted with horses as yesterday's evidence suggested. "Maybe you should try," he said, offering her the lead rope. Caitlin hesitated, her expression unreadable. Then she stepped forward and took the rope from his hands, her fingers brushing his briefly in the exchange. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through Marcus, an awareness that had nothing to do with horses and everything to do with the woman beside him. The moment Caitlin took control of the lead rope, Storm's edge transformed. The nervous energy that had made him dance and fret simply melted away. His head lowered, his breathing slowed, and he focused on Caitlin with the kind of attention usually reserved for herd leaders. "Walk on," Caitlin murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Storm's edge moved forward immediately, matching her pace with the precision of a partner rather than the reluctance of a student. As they circled the paddock, Caitlin's movements flowed with the horse's natural rhythm, creating a harmony that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. This wasn't just competence, this was artistry. "Change direction," Marcus called out, wanting to test the connection further. Without missing a beat, Caitlin guided Storm's edge through a smooth turn, reversing their direction with no resistance from the colt. She asked for stops, starts, and speed changes with subtle body language that the horse read as easily as written instructions. Emma appeared at the paddock fence, drawn by some instinct that told her she was witnessing something special. Her blue eyes widened as she watched Caitlin work, clearly recognizing skill that couldn't be taught or faked. "How long has it been since you worked with horses?" Marcus asked when Caitlin brought Storm's edge to a perfect halt near the fence. 6 years, she replied, her hand moving automatically to stroke the colt's neck. "Since I lost the farm." "And you haven't forgotten anything?" "You don't forget the things that matter." Caitlin's voice held a note of longing that she quickly suppressed. "This is what I used to do every morning. Train the young ones, work with problem horses, help them find their balance." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that went deeper than physical attraction or even admiration for her skill. This woman belonged here among his horses in a way that few people ever would. The tragedy wasn't just that she'd lost her freedom at the auction. It was that she'd been separated from her calling for 6 long years. "Would you like to work with another one?" he asked. Caitlin's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the hunger beneath her careful control. Yes, they spent the next 3 hours in the paddock, working through exercises with all 3 colts. Caitlin's technique was different from Marcus's, more intuitive, less structured, but undeniably effective. The horses responded to her with enthusiasm that bordered on eagerness, as if they recognized a kindred spirit by the time they finished. Both humans and horses were breathing hard but satisfied. Marcus watched Caitlin say goodbye to each colt individually, her hands gentle on their faces as she whispered words too soft for him to hear. "You're wasted on anything that isn't this," he said as they walked back toward the barn. Caitlin glanced at him sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you belong with horses. Not in some factory or office or any of the other places you might have ended up yesterday." "I belong wherever I choose to be," Caitlin replied with warmth. "That's what freedom means. And if I gave you that choice? If I told you the contract could be modified, that you could stay here and work with the horses because you want to, not because you have to." Caitlin stopped walking, her expression cycling through surprise, suspicion, and something that might have been hope before settling into wariness. "Why would you do that?" Marcus found himself at a loss for words. Why would he consider modifying a legally binding contract that gave him 2 years of guaranteed labor? The practical answer was that willing partners were always more valuable than reluctant ones. But the truth was more complex than that. The truth was that watching Caitlin work with his horses had awakened something in him that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with recognition. She belonged here, not because he owned her, but because this place needed what she could offer. And maybe, just maybe, she needed what it could offer her in return. Because, he said finally, maybe Emma was right yesterday. Maybe you're not the only one who needs rescuing. Before Caitlin could respond, the sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted their conversation. A black SUV was making its way up the gravel drive, moving with the measured pace of official business. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he recognized the vehicle. Sheriff Coleman Hayes was paying them a visit. And something told Marcus this wasn't a social call. As the SUV came to a stop near the barn, Marcus caught sight of Caitlin's face. All the softness from their morning with the horses had vanished, replaced by the tactical alertness he'd seen at the auction. Her body coiled with tension, ready for flight or fight. Whatever brought Hayes to Ironwood Stables today, Marcus had a feeling it would test every fragile trust they'd begun to build. Sheriff Coleman Hayes emerged from the black SUV with deliberate slowness, his bulk shifting as he adjusted his gun belt and straightened his khaki uniform. At 45, Hayes carried himself with the careful authority of a man who understood that respect came from the badge, not the person wearing it. His pale eyes swept the ranch with professional assessment before settling on Marcus and Caitlin, standing near the barn. "Morning, Marcus," Hayes called out, his tone deceptively casual. "Beautiful day for horse training." Marcus felt Caitlin tense beside him, her body coiling like a spring under pressure. Every instinct screamed at him to step protectively in front of her, but he forced himself to remain still. Hayes was like a predator's sudden movements would only trigger his hunting instincts. "Coleman," Marcus replied with careful neutrality, "what brings you out this way?" Hayes approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Official business, I'm afraid. Got a report about your new employee here." His gaze fixed on Caitlin with uncomfortable intensity. "Seems there are some concerns about her." "Adjustment to civilian life. What kind of concerns?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Ezra Blackwood filed a complaint this morning. Says he has reason to believe Miss Morrison here might be planning something foolish. Something that could violate the terms of her contract and put everyone involved in legal jeopardy." The words hung in the mountain air like a threat. Marcus felt his jaw clench as the implications became clear. Blackwood wasn't letting this go. Losing the bidding war had wounded his pride, and now he was using Hayes as his personal enforcement arm. "What kind of complaint?" Marcus pressed. Hayes pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket, making a show of consulting it. "Says he has information suggesting Miss Morrison might attempt to flee her lawful employment. Also mentions concerns about her violent tendencies and the danger she might pose to innocent folks." Caitlin spoke for the first time since Hayes arrived, her voice carrying the flat calm of someone who'd heard similar accusations before. "And what information would that be, Sheriff?" Hayes's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Well now, that's interesting. Mr. Blackwood says he's been making inquiries about your background, Miss Morrison. Turns out you've got quite the history of running from your obligations." Marcus watched Caitlin's face, looking for signs of fear or guilt. Instead, he saw something far more dangerous, the cold calculation of someone preparing for battle. "My obligations," Caitlin repeated slowly. "Is that what we're calling it?" "Contract labor is legal labor," Hayes replied with bureaucratic precision. "The state of Virginia takes these agreements very seriously. Breach of contract can result in significant penalties, including imprisonment. And if the contract was obtained under false pretenses?" Hayes's expression hardened. "That would be a serious accusation, Miss Morrison. One that would require substantial proof." Marcus stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Hayes and Caitlin without making it obvious. "Coleman, what exactly are you here to do? Caitlin hasn't violated anything, and as far as I know, thinking about running isn't a crime." "No, but conspiracy to defraud is." Hayes folded the paper and returned it to his pocket. "Mr. Blackwood believes Miss Morrison might try to convince you to release her from the contract without proper legal proceedings. That would constitute fraud on both your parts." The accusation was ridiculous, and they all knew it, but Marcus realized that wasn't the point. This was intimidation, pure and simple. Blackwood was using Hayes to remind them both that he had long arms and a longer memory. "I appreciate the warning," Marcus said carefully, "but I think I can handle my own business affairs." "I'm sure you can," Hayes agreed. "But Mr. Blackwood asked me to deliver a personal message. He says to tell you that he's still very interested in completing a transaction regarding Miss Morrison. Says he'd be willing to compensate you for any inconvenience if you decide the arrangement isn't working out." The threat was crystal clear now. Blackwood wanted Caitlin, and he wasn't going to stop pushing until he got her. The offer to compensate, Marcus, was just another way of saying that refusing to cooperate would have consequences. "You can tell Mr. Blackwood that I'm satisfied with my purchase," Marcus replied with ice in his voice, "and that any future communication should go through proper legal channels." Hayes nodded as if he'd expected that response. "I'll pass that along. But Marcus, you might want to think carefully about what you're getting into. Some people attract trouble wherever they go." His gaze shifted meaningfully to Caitlin. "Wouldn't want that trouble to spread to your family." The mention of Emma sent a spike of fear through Marcus's chest. Hayes was escalating from intimidation to outright threats, and everyone present understood the implications. "Is that an official warning, Sheriff?" Marcus asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Just friendly advice between neighbors," Hayes replied with false casualness. "Though I should mention that I'll be increasing patrols in this area. You know, making sure everyone stays safe and follows the law." With that parting shot, Hayes tipped his hat mockingly and walked back to his SUV. The engine started with authority, and he drove away slowly, making sure his presence would be remembered long after the dust settled. Marcus and Caitlin stood in silence until the sound of the engine faded completely. Only then did Marcus realize that his hands were clenched into fists and his heart was pounding like he'd been running uphill. "Well," Caitlin said with bitter humor, "that was educational." "Caitlin, don't." She held up a hand to stop whatever he was about to say. "Don't apologize, don't make excuses, and don't pretend this is going to get better. This is exactly what I expected to happen." Marcus stared at her, seeing the resignation in her eyes and hating himself for being the cause of it. "You think I'm going to give you back to him, aren't you?" Caitlin's challenge was quiet but devastating. "When he starts threatening your sister, when the pressure gets too much, when keeping me becomes more trouble than it's worth, aren't you going to take his offer?" The question hung between them like a chasm. Marcus wanted to deny it immediately, to swear that nothing would make him betray her trust. But the truth was more complicated than that. He'd bought her on impulse, motivated by factors he still didn't fully understand. When faced with serious consequences, legal trouble, threats to Emma, damage to his business, would his commitment hold? "I don't know," he finally admitted. The honesty seemed to surprise Caitlin. She'd clearly expected either lies or immediate capitulation, not this painful acknowledgement of uncertainty. "At least you're honest about it," she said. Before Marcus could respond, Emma appeared around the corner of the barn, her face flushed with anger. She'd obviously been close enough to hear at least part of the conversation with Hayes. "What was that snake doing here?" Emma demanded. "Delivering Blackwood's message," Marcus replied grimly. "Apparently we're being watched now." Emma's blue eyes flashed with fury. "He threatened us? Actually threatened us?" "Indirectly," Marcus said. "But yeah, that's it." Emma's jaw set with determination that Marcus recognized from their childhood. When Emma made that face, nothing could change her mind. "I'm calling Dad's lawyer. There has to be something we can do about this harassment." Emma, wait, but she was already striding toward the house, muttering under her breath about corrupt sheriffs and bullying rich men. Marcus watched her go with a mixture of pride and worry. Emma's protective instincts were admirable, but they might also make the situation worse. "She's going to get hurt because of me," Caitlin said quietly. Marcus turned back to find her watching Emma's retreating figure with an expression of guilt and determination. "This isn't your fault," he said. "Isn't it?" Caitlin's laugh was sharp. "I'm the one Blackwood wants. I'm the reason Hayes was here making threats. Your sister is in danger because you decided to buy me instead of letting him have what he wanted. Emma's in danger because Blackwood is a controlling sociopath who can't stand losing," Marcus corrected. "Don't take responsibility for his actions." Caitlin studied his face with those penetrating green eyes. "You really believe that?" "I know that." "Then why did you say you didn't know if you'd give me back to him?" The question cut straight to the heart of Marcus's internal conflict. He believed in protecting Caitlin from Blackwood, but he also had responsibilities to Emma, to the ranch, to the life he'd built in these mountains. How much was he willing to sacrifice for someone he'd known less than 48 hours? "Because I'm not a hero," Marcus said finally. "I'm just a guy who makes mistakes and tries to live with the consequences. And right now, I don't know what all the consequences are going to be." Something shifted in Caitlin's expression, a softening that hadn't been there before. "That's more honesty than I've gotten from anyone in years. Honesty's about all I have to offer right now. It's more than you think." They were interrupted by the sound of another vehicle coming up the drive. This time it was a familiar red pickup truck that made Marcus relax slightly. Dr. Sarah Chun, the local veterinarian, was making her scheduled call to check on Thunder Canyon's leg. Sarah emerged from her truck with the brisk efficiency that had made her one of the most respected vets in 3 counties. At 32, Shed built her practice from nothing after graduating from veterinary school, earning trust through competence and dedication rather than connections. "Morning, Marcus," Sarah called out as she gathered her equipment. "Ready to take a look at that stallion?" "More than ready," Marcus replied. His leg's been bothering him for 3 days now. As Sarah approached, her dark eyes took in the tension between Marcus and Caitlin with professional observation. "Everything all right? You both look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Marcus said. "Sarah, this is Caitlin Morrison. She's working with the horses now." Sarah extended her hand with a warm smile. "Nice to meet you, Caitlin. Any experience with veterinary work?" "Some," Caitlin replied, shaking Sarah's hand. "My grandfather taught me basic first aid for horses." "Excellent. Mind giving me a hand with Thunder Canyon? Extra's eyes are always helpful." As they walked toward the pasture where Thunder Canyon grazed, Marcus found himself grateful for Sarah's presence. Her professional focus and calm demeanor created a buffer against the tension that had been building since Hayes's visit. Thunder Canyon allowed himself to be haltered and led to the examination area without fuss, though Marcus noticed the stallion's attention kept drifting to Caitlin. The horse's behavior around her continued to fascinate him. There was a recognition there that went beyond normal animal-human interaction. Sarah's examination was thorough and methodical. She checked the stallion's leg from hoof to shoulder, palpating for heat, swelling, or sensitivity. Thunder Canyon stood perfectly still throughout the process, though his ears remained fixed on Caitlin's position near his head. "There's some inflammation in the fetlock joint," Sarah announced finally. "Nothing serious, but it needs attention. Probably strained it running in the pasture." "Treatment?" Marcus asked. "Anti-inflammatory medication, cold therapy, and limited activity for a week. Should clear up completely with proper care." As Sarah prepared the injection, She glanced at Caitlin with professional curiosity. You have a gift with horses. Thunder Canyon's completely relaxed with you there. He's a good horse, Caitlin replied simply. They usually are, when they trust someone. Sarah administered the injection with practiced skill. Marcus, you'll want to cold hose this leg twice daily for the next 3 days. After that, we can. Reassess. I can handle the cold hosing, Caitlin offered. Sarah nodded approvingly. Perfect. Just 15 minutes at a time. Use the gentlest setting on the hose, and watch for any signs of increased inflammation. As they led Thunder Canyon back to his pasture, Sarah fell into step beside Marcus. She knows what she's doing, the vet said quietly. Where did you find her? The question was innocent enough, but it highlighted the complexity of Marcus's situation. How did you explain that you'd bought someone at an auction without sounding like exactly what you were? It's complicated, Marcus said finally. Sarah's expression grew more serious. Marcus, is everything all right? Really? Before Marcus could answer, the sound of raised voices from the house drew their attention. Through the windows they could see Emma pacing back and forth, clearly agitated as she spoke on the phone. Family drama, Marcus said with forced lightness. You know how it is. But Sarah's expression remained concerned as she packed up her equipment. Call me if you need anything, she said. And I mean anything, Marcus. Some problems require more than veterinary solutions. After Sarah left, Marcus found himself alone with Caitlin again. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the trees, casting long shadows across the ranch. In a few hours, it would be dark, and he still had no idea how to handle the crisis that was building around them. The vet likes you, Caitlin observed. Sarah's a good friend, Marcus replied. Known her since college. She's worried about you. Marcus glanced at Caitlin, surprised by her perceptiveness. How can you tell? Same way I can tell you're trying to figure out how to protect everyone without knowing who needs protecting from what. Caitlin's voice held a note of sympathy that caught him off guard. It's written all over your face. Any suggestions? Yeah. Caitlin turned to face him fully, her green eyes holding a determination that both impressed and worried him. Let me leave. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. What? You heard me. Let me walk away tonight, before this gets any worse. Tell Blackwood I ran off. File whatever reports you need to file, and wash your hands of the whole mess. Caitlin, think about it, she pressed on. I disappear, Blackwood loses interest, Hayes stops making threats, and your sister stays safe. Everyone wins. Except you. Caitlin's smile was sad but resolute. I've been taking care of myself for 6 years, Marcus. I'll be fine. Marcus stared at her, seeing the courage it took to make such an offer. She was willing to sacrifice her own safety to protect people she barely knew. The gesture revealed a nobility that made his chest ache with emotions he didn't fully understand. No, he said quietly, no. I'm not letting you walk into the night to face God knows what just to make my life easier. Marcus's voice grew stronger as he spoke. We'll figure out another way. What if there isn't another way? Marcus looked around at the ranch his grandfather had built, the legacy his father had preserved, the home that had sheltered 3 generations of Whitfields. Then he looked at Caitlin, this fierce woman who'd stumbled into his life and turned everything upside down in less than 2 days. Then we'll make one, he said. For the first time since he'd bought her, Caitlin Morrison smiled at him without reservation. It transformed her entire face, revealing a beauty that had nothing to do with features and everything to do with the light that shone from within when hope replaced despair. In that moment, Marcus realized that his earlier uncertainty had crystallized into absolute certainty. Whatever came next, whatever Blackwood threatened or Hayes demanded, he wasn't giving her up. The only question now was whether he'd have the strength to keep that promise when the real test came. 3 days after Sheriff Hayes's visit, the first Sabotage occurred at dawn. Marcus discovered it when he went to check on the horses for morning feeding. The gate to the main pasture hung wide open, its heavy chain cut cleanly through with bolt cutters. 6 of his most valuable breeding mares had wandered onto the mountain road during the night, including Wildfire Rose, a prize-winning quarter horse worth more than Marcus's truck. Heart-hammering, he spent the next 4 hours tracking down the scattered animals with Emma and Caitlin's help. They found 5 mares grazing peacefully in a neighbor's lower field, but Wildfire Rose had ventured further, nearly reaching the dangerous curves where mountain roads claimed vehicles every winter. This wasn't an accident, Emma declared as they led the final mare back to safety. Her blonde hair was matted with sweat and her clothes torn from pushing through brambles, but her blue eyes blazed with fury. Someone cut that chain deliberately. Marcus examined the severed links, noting the clean cuts that spoke of professional tools and deliberate intent. Blackwood sending a message. Caitlin stood apart from the siblings, her green eyes scanning the tree line that bordered the property. "It's going to get worse," she said quietly. This was just a warning. She was right, and they all knew it. Ezra Blackwood had built his empire through calculated pressure and escalating consequences. The opened gate was his way of demonstrating that Ironwood Stables wasn't as secure as Marcus believed. That afternoon brought a visit from building Inspector Vincent Russo, a thin man with nervous eyes who'd never shown interest in the ranch before. He arrived with an official clipboard and a manufactured concern about structural integrity reports that had supposedly been filed anonymously. Marcus watched in growing anger as Russo examined perfectly sound buildings with suspicious thoroughness, taking photographs and making notes about violations that existed only in imagination. The barn that had weathered 97 years of mountain storms suddenly needed extensive repairs. The training arena required new drainage systems. The hay storage facility violated updated fire codes that had been written the previous month. "These citations require immediate attention," Russo explained with bureaucratic precision. "Failure to comply within 30 days will result in a cease and desist order for all commercial activities on the property." The fines totaled nearly $15,000, money Marcus didn't have without selling horses he couldn't afford to lose. The timing was no coincidence. Blackwood's network of influence reached into every corner of the county government. "This is harassment," Emma protested, her voice shaking with rage. "Pure and simple harassment," Russo shrugged with practiced indifference. "I just enforce the regulations, ma'am. If you have concerns about the citations, you can file an appeal through the proper channels. Appeals that would take months to process while the cease and desist order destroyed Marcus's business." Another message from Blackwood, delivered with legal precision and plausible deniability. After Russo left, Marcus found himself staring at the stack of citations with a growing sense of helplessness. He'd built his life around the principle that hard work and integrity would eventually triumph over corruption and influence. But Blackwood operated in a world where money and connections trumped both effort and honor. "You're thinking about his offer," Caitlin observed. Marcus looked up to find her standing in the barn doorway, her expression unreadable in the afternoon shadows. "What?" "Blackwood's offer to compensate you for giving me up." "You're thinking about it." The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. Marcus wasn't seriously considering betraying Caitlin, but the mounting pressure was making him question everything. How much damage was he willing to absorb? How much risk could he ask Emma to share? "No," he said firmly. "I'm thinking about how to fight back. With what weapons?" Caitlin stepped into the barn, her movements carrying the fluid grace he'd learned to associate with her presence. "He has money, political connections, and legal authority on his side." "What do you have? The truth?" Caitlin's laugh held no humor. "The truth is a luxury for people who can afford lawyers and publicity campaigns. For people like us, the truth is whatever powerful men say it is." The bitterness in her voice made Marcus look at her more closely. "What happened to you, Caitlin? Before the auction, before you lost your grandfather's farm, what made you so sure that the system is rigged?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then she moved to Moonlight's stall, her hand reaching automatically to stroke the mare's face. The horse nickered softly, pressing against Caitlin's palm with obvious affection. "I was engaged once," Caitlin said finally, her voice so quiet that Marcus had to strain to hear. "His name was Daniel Wright, son of a state senator, heir to a banking fortune, everything a girl from a small farm was supposed to want." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What happened? I thought I loved him. More importantly, I thought he loved me." Caitlin's hand stilled on Moonlight's neck. "When my grandfather died and the farm went into foreclosure, Daniel promised to help. Said his family's bank could restructure the loan, give me time to establish my own income. But they didn't." "Oh." "They restructured it. Right into Daniel's name at a fraction of its actual value. By the time I realized what had happened, the Wright family owned everything, the land, the horses, even my grandfather's tax collection that had been in our family for 4 generations. Marcus felt anger building in his chest, hot and righteous. "He stole it from you. Legally, he purchased it through proper foreclosure proceedings." Caitlin's voice remained carefully controlled, but Marcus could see the pain beneath her composed facade. "When I confronted him, he explained that business was business. Said he'd still marry me if I was willing to be reasonable about my expectations." "Meaning?" "Meaning I could be his pretty wife and never mention the theft of my inheritance. I could smile at parties and play the grateful rescued farm girl who'd married above her station." Caitlin's green eyes flashed with remembered fury. "I told him exactly what he could do with his generous offer. Good for you, was it?" Caitlin turned away from Moonlight to face Marcus directly. "Because refusing him cost me everything. The engagement ended, which meant the social connections disappeared. Without connections, I couldn't find work in any related field. The Wright family made sure that every stable, every horse farm, every riding academy in 3 states knew I was difficult and unreliable." Marcus began to understand the path that had led Caitlin to the auction house. Blacklisted from the work she loved, cut off from the life she'd known, she would have been forced to take whatever employment she could find. And in a system designed to exploit the desperate, that road led inevitably to contract labor and human trafficking disguised as legal employment. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Don't be sorry. Learn from it." Caitlin's voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Men like Blackwood and the Wrights don't just take what they want. They destroy anyone who tries to stop them. They have resources, patience, and absolutely no conscience about collateral damage. So what are you suggesting? That I give up?" "I'm suggesting that you recognize reality before it destroys everything you care about." Caitlin gestured toward the barn around them, the home Marcus had inherited from generations of honest work. "This place, your sister, your whole life, Blackwood will tear it all down to get what he wants. And what he wants is me, broken and submissive, as proof that nobody defies him successfully." Marcus stared at her, seeing the courage it took to speak those words. She was offering herself as a sacrifice again, trying to protect him from consequences that weren't her fault. "There has to be another way," he insisted. "What way? Running? We'd never be safe, and you'd lose everything anyway. Fighting? With what army?" Before Marcus could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. Through the barn door, they could see a convoy of black SUVs making their way up the gravel drive. Too many vehicles for a social call, moving with the organized precision of a military operation. "Stay here," Marcus ordered, his protective instincts surging. But Caitlin was already moving toward the barn's rear exit, her body coiled with the tension of someone preparing to run. "This is it," she said grimly. "He's not waiting anymore." The vehicles came to a stop in front of the main house with mathematical precision. Car doors slammed in sequence as dark-suited men emerged, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Sheriff Hayes climbed out of the lead SUV, his face set in grim determination, but it was the figure emerging from the second vehicle that made Marcus's blood run cold. Ezra Blackwood himself had come to collect his prize, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. At 62, he moved with the confident stride of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. Emma appeared on the front porch, her face pale but her chin raised in defiance. Marcus started toward the house, but Caitlin caught his arm. With surprising strength, "Don't," she said urgently. "This is what he wants, an excuse to escalate. Let me handle this." "Like hell." "Marcus, please." Caitlin's grip tightened, her green eyes pleading. "I know men like him. If you give him a reason to claim you're interfering with a legal proceeding, he'll destroy you completely." Before Marcus could argue, Hayes's voice boomed across the ranch. "Yard, Marcus Whitfield, come on out here. We need to have a conversation." Marcus and Caitlin emerged from the barn together, walking slowly toward the assembled force. Marcus counted 6 armed men in addition to Hayes and Blackwood, enough firepower to handle a small army, let alone one unarmed ranch family. "Sheriff Hayes," Marcus called out, fighting to keep his voice steady. "What can I do for you?" "We're here about Miss Morrison," Hayes replied, consulting an official-looking document. "Got a court order here requiring her to submit to questioning regarding suspected contract violations." Marcus felt his heart sink. A court order meant judges and lawyers and legal proceedings that could drag on indefinitely while Caitlin remained in custody. Blackwood had used his influence to weaponize the justice system itself. "What violations?" Marcus demanded. Blackwood stepped forward with predatory satisfaction. "Conspiracy to defraud, for starters. We have evidence that Miss Morrison has been planning to breach her legal contract with the intent to cause financial harm to her lawful employer. That's ridiculous. She's been working with the horses, nothing more. Has she?" Blackwood's smile was cold as winter steel. "Then you won't mind if we search the premises for evidence of flight preparation. Hidden money, false identification, transportation arrangements, the usual tools of contract jumpers." The search threat was another trap. Even if they found nothing incriminating, the process would provide opportunities to plant evidence or damage property while Marcus stood helplessly by. "You don't have a search warrant," Emma called out from the porch, her legal research finally paying dividends. "Don't need one," Hayes replied smugly. "Miss Morrison's contract allows for inspection of her living quarters and work areas at any time, standard provision in employment agreements." Marcus felt the walls closing in around them. Every legal avenue had been anticipated and blocked, every potential escape route cut off by superior planning and infinite resources. Caitlin stepped forward, her movements carrying the fluid grace of someone walking toward execution with dignity intact. "I'll come with you," she said simply. "No," Marcus said immediately. "It's not your choice," Blackwood interjected, his voice carrying a smug triumph. "Miss Morrison is bound by legal contract to comply with lawful directives from authorized representatives. And if she refuses, then she faces criminal charges for contract violation, and you face charges for interfering with the legal process." Blackwood's smile widened. "Either way, gentlemen, this ends today." Marcus looked at Caitlin, seeing the resignation in her green eyes and hating himself for being helpless to prevent it. 3 days ago, he'd promised to find another way. Now, that promise was crumbling like everything else under Blackwood's relentless pressure. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Caitlin's hand touched his briefly, the contact electric despite the circumstances. "Don't be. You tried." As Hayes moved forward with handcuffs, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made everyone turn. Thunder Canyon was galloping toward them across the main pasture, his magnificent form powerful and urgent as he bore down on the assembled group. The stallion leaped the pasture fence with athletic grace, landing in the ranch yard with ground shaking. Impact. Several of Blackwood's men reached for their weapons, but Thunder Canyon ignored them completely. Instead, the horse positioned himself between Caitlin and her would-be captors, his dark eyes blazing with protective fury. He stood perfectly still, but every line of his body radiated dangerous potential. "Well," Blackwood murmured, his voice carrying genuine surprise, "that's interesting." Behind Thunder Canyon, other horses were gathering at the fence line, Moonlight, Storm's Edge, and the rest of Marcus's breeding stock. They stood watching the confrontation with alert intensity, as if waiting for some signal to act. For the first time since arriving, Blackwood looked uncertain. He was a man who understood power and intimidation, but the horse's behavior fell outside his experience. Animals weren't supposed to involve themselves in human conflicts. Caitlin stepped toward Thunder Canyon, her hand extended in greeting. The stallion nickered softly, nuzzling her palm with obvious affection. The gesture was so natural, so clearly the recognition between kindred spirits, that everyone watching felt they were witnessing something profound. "Beautiful animal," Blackwood said finally, his voice carrying a different note. Shame if something happened to him. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. If Caitlin didn't cooperate, the horses might suffer for her defiance. Marcus felt something break inside his chest, the last restraint on anger that had been building for days. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't what?" Blackwood's eyebrows rose. In mock innocence, "Don't threaten my horses." "I'm simply observing that accidents happen, Mr. Whitfield, especially when people make poor choices about cooperation." Marcus took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists. Behind him, he could hear Emma's sharp intake of breath and Caitlin's whispered warning. But the red haze of fury was descending, washing away caution and calculation. 3 generations of Whitfield men had built this ranch through honest work and dedication. His grandfather had died protecting this land from developers. His father had sacrificed his health maintaining the family legacy, and Marcus had devoted his entire adult life to honoring their memory. Now, this parasite in an expensive suit was threatening to destroy it all for the sake of his wounded pride. "Get off my property," Marcus said, his voice carrying deadly calm. Blackwood's expression hardened. "I have legal authority." "Get off my property," Marcus repeated, stepping closer. Now, for a moment, the standoff balanced on a knife's edge. Then Blackwood smiled with genuine appreciation, as if Marcus had finally provided the reaction he'd been hoping for. "Sheriff Hayes," Blackwood said, without taking his eyes off Marcus. "I believe Mr. Whitfield just threatened the lawful representative of the court. That sounds like obstruction of justice to me." Hayes nodded grimly, his hand moving to his handcuffs. "Marcus Whitfield, you're under arrest." As the metal restraints clicked around his wrists, Marcus caught sight of Caitlin's face. Her green eyes held a mixture of admiration and despair, as if she'd just watched someone she cared about make a heroic but ultimately pointless gesture. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd just destroyed his last chance to protect her. But as they led him toward the SUV, Thunder Canyon's defiant whinny echoing across the mountains, Marcus realized he didn't regret it. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight was hopeless. The Millbrook County Jail had seen better decades. Built in 1963 during an optimistic period of municipal expansion, it now bore the scars of budget cuts and bureaucratic neglect. The holding cells smelled of disinfectant and despair, their concrete. Walls painted institutional green and decorated with graffiti from previous occupants. Marcus sat on the narrow bench that served as both bed and furniture, his hands still bearing red marks from the handcuffs Hayes had finally removed an hour ago. Through the barred window, he could see the mountains in the distance, the same peaks that overlooked Ironwood stables and reminded him of everything he'd failed to protect. 20-4 hours. That's how long he'd been locked up while Blackwood consolidated his victory. 24 hours of imagining what might be happening to Caitlin, to Emma, to the horses that had trusted him to keep them safe. The uncertainty was worse than physical pain. The sound of approaching footsteps made Marcus look up from his brooding. Sheriff Hayes appeared outside the cell, his expression unreadable as he fumbled with his key ring. "Your lawyer's here, Hayes," announced without preamble. Marcus frowned. "I didn't call a lawyer." "Someone did." Hayes swung the cell door open with rusty protests. "And they posted your bail. Lucky you." The booking area buzzed with activity as Marcus was processed out of custody. His personal effects wallet, keys, and phone were returned in a manila envelope that had seen better days. But it was the woman waiting in the lobby who captured his attention completely. Rebecca Torres stood with the confident posture of someone accustomed to commanding courtrooms and intimidating opponents. At 41, she'd built a reputation as one of Virginia's most formidable civil rights attorneys, specializing in cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch. Her black hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and her dark eyes held the sharp intelligence of a predator sizing up prey. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, extending a manicured hand. "Rebecca Torres, Civil Rights Legal Foundation. We need to talk." Marcus shook her hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that spoke of complete self-assurance. "I appreciate whatever you've done, but I can't afford. My services are being provided pro bono," Torres interrupted smoothly. "Courtesy of a mutual friend who believes your case has broader implications than personal conflict." "What mutual friend?" Torres smiled with professional mystery. "Someone who prefers to remain anonymous but has a vested interest in seeing Ezra Blackwood's little empire exposed to public scrutiny." As they walked toward the parking garage, Torres briefed Marcus on the legal landscape he'd stumbled into. The charges against him, obstruction of justice and interfering with court proceedings, were serious but defensible. More importantly, his arrest had created opportunities that hadn't existed before. Blackwood made a mistake, Torres explained as they reached her silver BMW. He got greedy and overplayed his hand. The court order he used to justify yesterday's raid was obtained through false pretenses and procedural violations that we can challenge. Marcus climbed into the passenger seat, his mind still reeling from the rapid developments. "What about Caitlin? Where is she?" Torres's expression darkened slightly. "That's where things get complicated. Blackwood has her in a private facility that technically operates within legal boundaries. She's being held for psychological evaluation, pending resolution of the contract dispute." "Psychological evaluation?" "A convenient way to isolate someone while you break their will," Torres said grimly. "The Riverside Treatment Center specializes in making inconvenient people disappear into bureaucratic limbo." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. "How long can they hold her?" "Indefinitely, if nobody challenges the process." Torres started the car and pulled out of the parking garage. "Which is why we're going to challenge everything: the contract, the court order, the arrest, and Blackwood's entire network of corruption." As they drove through Millbrook's struggling downtown, Torres outlined a legal strategy that was ambitious to the point of recklessness. Rather than simply defending Marcus and Caitlin individually, she planned to attack the entire system that enabled human trafficking under the guise of employment contracts. The Civil Rights Legal Foundation has been building a case against contract labor abuses for 3 years, she explained. "We have documentation of hundreds of similar situations, but we've lacked a catalyst, someone willing to fight publicly and accept the risks that come with challenging powerful interests. And you think I'm that catalyst? I think you're a man who paid $1,000 for someone else's freedom and got arrested protecting his horses from a bully." Torres's smile held genuine warmth for the first time since they'd met. That suggests a character worth betting on. They drove in comfortable silence for several minutes, the mountain scenery flowing past the windows like a reminder of what Marcus was fighting to protect. But it was Torres's next words that stopped his breath completely. "There's something else you should know about Caitlin Morrison's real identity." Marcus turned to stare at the lawyer, his heart suddenly hammering. "What do you mean?" "Caitlin Morrison is an assumed name. Her real name is Caitlin Ray Sullivan, and she's the granddaughter of Patrick Sullivan, one of the most respected horse trainers in Kentucky history." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. Patrick Sullivan was a legend in quarter horse breeding circles, a man whose bloodlines had produced champions for 4 decades. Marcus owned 2 horses with Sullivan genetics in their pedigree, animals he'd paid premium prices to acquire. "Sullivan died 6 years ago," Torres continued. "Left his entire operation to his granddaughter, along with debts that forced her to sell everything. What she didn't know was that the buyer right, banking and investment, had manipulated the sale through predatory lending practices." Marcus thought of Caitlin's bitter story about her failed engagement to Daniel Wright, suddenly understanding the deeper layers of betrayal involved. She hadn't just lost a fiancé and a farm. She'd lost her family's legacy to the same man who'd claimed to love her. "The Sullivan bloodlines are worth millions," Torres said quietly. "Caitlin isn't just a victim of human trafficking. She's the heir to one of the most valuable genetic libraries in American quarter horse breeding. And Daniel Wright has been profiting from her grandfather's work for 6 years while she's been trapped in contract labor." The scope of the theft was staggering. Marcus knew enough about horse breeding to understand that controlling Sullivan genetics gave Wright unprecedented influence in the industry. Champions bred from those bloodlines would command enormous stud fees and sale prices, generating wealth that belonged rightfully to Caitlin. "Can we prove it?" Marcus asked. "We can prove the predatory lending practices. We can prove the manipulation of probate proceedings. And with your help, we can prove that Wright Industries has been using trafficked labor to maintain facilities bought with stolen assets." Torres pulled into the parking lot of a small diner outside town, her expression growing more serious. "But first, we need to get Caitlin back. And that's going to require resources that go beyond legal procedures." Inside the diner, Marcus discovered that Torres hadn't been working alone. A woman sitting in a corner booth raised her hand in greeting. "Dr. Sarah Chun, the veterinarian who treated Thunder Canyon 3 days ago." "Sarah?" Marcus slid into the booth across from her, his confusion obvious. "What are you doing here?" "Apparently, I'm part of a conspiracy," Sarah said with dry humor. "Though I prefer to think of it as a professional intervention." Torres settled beside Sarah, her expression all business. "Dr. Chun has been documenting animal welfare violations at Wright-owned facilities for 2 years. Her reports have been instrumental in building our case." Sarah nodded grimly. "The conditions at some of these places are appalling. Horses kept in overcrowded stalls, minimal veterinary care, breeding programs that prioritize profit over animal health. I've been filing reports with state agencies, but they get buried in bureaucratic procedures." "And Caitlin?" Marcus asked. "Is being held at a facility that also houses some of the Sullivan horses Wright acquired." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "Horses that should belong to her, being used to breed the next generation of champions while she's locked away where she can't claim her inheritance." Marcus felt the pieces clicking into place. This wasn't just about one woman's freedom or one man's wounded pride. This was about a systematic theft that had been operating for years, protected by legal technicalities and official corruption. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Torres leaned forward, her expression intense. "We need you to trust us completely and follow our lead, even when it seems impossible. We're going to attempt something that's never been tried before, a coordinated legal and media assault that exposes everything at once. And if it fails, then we all go down together," Sarah said matter-of-factly. Blackwood right, and their network won't show mercy to people who've threatened their operations. Marcus thought of Caitlin locked away in some sterile facility, surrounded by the horses that should have been her birthright. He thought of Emma facing threats alone while he sat in jail. He thought of Thunder Canyon's defiant stand against armed men who'd invaded their home. What's the plan? He asked. Torres pulled out a tablet, her fingers flying across the screen as she accessed encrypted files. Phase 1 is a coordinated media release documenting the connection between contract labor abuses and animal welfare violations. We're talking to investigative journalists at 3 major newspapers and 2 television networks. Phase 2, Sarah continued, involves simultaneous raids on multiple facilities, conducted by federal agencies with jurisdiction over human trafficking and animal welfare. We've been feeding information to FBI and Department of Agriculture investigators for months. And Phase 3? Marcus asked. Torres's smile was sharp as a blade. Phase 3 is where you come in. We're going to need someone to testify publicly about the human cost of this operation. Someone whose story can put a face on what these numbers and reports really mean. Marcus understood the implications immediately. Testifying publicly would make him a permanent target for retaliation. His business, his family, his entire life would be subject to scrutiny and attack from powerful enemies with unlimited resources. But it would also give Caitlin a chance at justice. When do we start? He asked. We already have, Torres replied. The first news stories go live in 6 hours. Federal warrants were signed this morning, and your bail conditions have been modified to allow you to accompany Dr. Chun on an emergency veterinary call to the Riverside Treatment Center. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. You're saying we can get to Caitlin today? We're saying we're going to try, Sarah corrected. But Marcus, you need to understand, once we do this, there's no going back. Blackwood and Wright will use every resource they have to destroy us. Through the diner window, Marcus could see the mountains that sheltered Ironwood stables and everything his family had built over 3 generations. In a few hours, he would either be on his way to rescuing the woman who'd changed his life, or he'd be running toward destruction that would claim everyone he loved. The choice should have been impossible. But looking at Torres and Sarah, seeing the determination in their faces and the courage of their commitment to justice, Marcus realized it was actually simple. Some fights were worth the risk, regardless of the odds. Let's go get her, he said. As they left the diner, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The words were simple but chilling. Your horses are beautiful. Shame if something happened to them while you're playing lawyer. Blackwood wasn't waiting for legal proceedings or media coverage. He was moving to end this confrontation before Torres and her allies could spring their trap. Marcus showed the message to his companions, watching their expressions harden with resolve. Change of plans, Torres said grimly. We move now. The race to save Caitlin and everything else they cared about had just begun. The Riverside Treatment Center squatted like a concrete tumor against the Virginia landscape, its brutalist architecture designed to intimidate rather than heal. Surrounded by 12-foot chain-link fencing topped with razor wire, the facility proclaimed its true purpose through security measures that had nothing to do with patient care and everything to do with preventing escape. Marcus crouched behind a utility building 200 yards from the main entrance, his heart hammering as he studied the guard rotations through borrowed binoculars. Beside him, Dr. Sarah Chun checked her medical bag for the 3rd time, her usually steady hands trembling slightly with nervous energy. 2 guards at the front gate, 1 roving patrol, cameras on the corners, Marcus whispered. How exactly are we supposed to get inside? Sarah pulled out an official-looking document from her bag. Emergency Veterinary Authorization. Rebecca's contact at the Department of Agriculture fast-tracked it through the system. As far as the computers know, there's been a report of equine Influenza at this facility, and I'm here to conduct mandatory health inspections. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. While federal agents prepared to execute search warrants at multiple right-connected facilities, Sarah would use her veterinary credentials to gain access to Riverside. Once inside, they would locate Caitlin and extract her during the confusion of what appeared to be a routine inspection. And if they check with their superiors? Marcus asked. They'll find that Ezra Blackwood is currently in an emergency board meeting regarding irregularities in facility operations, Sarah replied with grim satisfaction. Rebecca's other allies have been busy creating distractions. Through his earpiece, Marcus heard Teresa's voice providing updates from her mobile command center. Federal agents are in position at 6 locations. Media teams are standing by with prepared stories. We will go live in 15 minutes. Marcus thought of Emma, hopefully safe at a neighbor's house with instructions to call the FBI if anyone suspicious approached Ironwood Stables. He thought of Thunder Canyon and the other horses, their fate tied to decisions being made by people they'd never meet. Most of all, he thought of Caitlin, locked somewhere behind those concrete walls while the Sullivan horses that should have been her inheritance grazed in paddocks she couldn't see. I should have fought harder from the beginning, he muttered. Sarah touched his shoulder briefly. You fought exactly as hard as you could with the information you had. Now we fight with better weapons. The veterinary truck they'd borrowed from Sarah's clinic bore official logos and inspection decals that would satisfy casual observation. As they drove toward the gate, Marcus forced himself to breathe normally despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The guard who emerged from the gatehouse was young and bored, his uniform wrinkled and his attention focused more on his phone than the approaching vehicle. He glanced at Sarah's credentials with perfunctory interest before waving them through without checking Marcus's identification at all. First mistake, Sarah murmured as they drove into the compound. Securities. Too lax for a facility handling dangerous patients. The interior of Riverside resembled a minimum security prison more than a medical center. Long, low buildings connected by covered walkways stretched across 10 acres of sparse landscaping. Everything was painted institutional beige, as if the architects had deliberately chosen the most soul-crushing color available, but it was the stable complex at the far end of the compound that made Marcus's breath catch. 2 massive barns flanked by pristine paddocks housed what appeared to be some of the finest quarter horses he'd ever seen. Even at a distance, he could identify bloodlines that commanded 6-figure prices at auction. The Sullivan horses, Sarah confirmed, following his gaze. 37 head of championship breeding stock, technically owned by Wright Industries, but managed through this facility. Marcus counted the animals visible in the paddocks, his trained eye cataloging confirmation. Traits and genetic markers that spoke of careful breeding programs spanning decades. The wealth represented by these horses was staggering, not just in current market value, but in the future generations they could produce. And somewhere in this compound, the woman who should have inherited them was being held against her, Sarah. Parked the truck near the main administration building, her movements brisk and professional as she gathered her inspection equipment. Remember, she said quietly, you're my assistant. Let me do the talking until we locate the patient records. The lobby of the administration building assaulted them with the antiseptic smell of industrial disinfectant and the fluorescent buzz of cheap lighting. A receptionist with dead eyes and bleached hair looked up from her computer with obvious annoyance. Dr. Chen, Virginia Department of Agriculture, Sarah announced, presenting her credentials with authority that brooked no argument. I'm here to conduct emergency health inspections regarding reported equine influenza. The receptionist's boredom transformed into nervous attention. I wasn't told about any inspection. That's why it's called emergency protocol, Sarah replied coolly. I need to see your animal health records immediately, plus access to all equine facilities for physical examination. While Sarah engaged the receptionist in bureaucratic theater, Marcus studied the building's layout through glass partitions and open doorways. The patient wing stretched to the left, its corridors lined with doors that looked more like cell blocks than medical rooms. A nurse's station occupied the central hub, staffed by 2 people in scrubs who seemed more interested in surveillance than patient care. "Records are in the basement archives," the receptionist was explaining. "But I'll need to call the administrator." "No need," Sarah interrupted smoothly. "Federal regulations require immediate access during emergency inspections. Any delay could result in facility closure pending investigation." The magic words had their intended effect. The receptionist's face paled as she contemplated, explaining to her superiors why she'd obstructed a federal inspection. She reached for a key ring with shaking hands. "I'll escort you to the archives," she said quickly. The basement of Riverside felt like descending into a tomb. Concrete walls painted prison gray stretched in both directions, broken only by heavy metal doors marked with numbers rather than names. The archives occupied a windowless room lined with filing cabinets that looked older than the building itself. "Patient records are confidential," the receptionist said nervously as Sarah began examining files. "I'm not sure I can. Emergency health protocols override privacy regulations when public safety is at risk," Sarah stated with absolute conviction. Marcus marveled at her ability to sound completely official while essentially making up procedures. On the spot dot, as Sarah maintained the bureaucratic charade, Marcus studied the building's basement layout. A service corridor stretched toward the patient wing, probably used for laundry and food service. If Caitlin was being held in isolation, the basement would be the logical location. "I need to inspect your isolation facilities," Sarah announced. Suddenly, quarantine protocols require separate ventilation systems that could spread airborne pathogens. The receptionist looked uncertain. "The isolation wing is restricted access. Only medical staff." "I am medical staff," Sarah said firmly. "And I'm conducting a federal inspection. Do you want to explain to the Department of Agriculture why you prevented me from examining potential disease vectors?" 5 minutes later, they were following the nervous receptionist through corridors that grew progressively more institutional. The medical pretense became thinner with each locked door and security checkpoint, but Sarah's unwavering authority carried them forward. The isolation wing occupied the building's eastern end, its rooms equipped with reinforced doors and observation windows that had nothing to do with medical monitoring. This wasn't a treatment facility. It was a prison designed to break spirits through sensory deprivation and psychological pressure. "Room 47, the receptionist said, stopping before a door marked only with a number. "But the patient is under strict psychiatric hold. No visitors without administrator approval." Through the observation window, Marcus saw her. Caitlin sat on a narrow cot in a windowless room, painted institutional white. Her auburn hair hung loose around her shoulders, and she wore the shapeless gray scrubs that marked her as a patient rather than a person. But her green eyes remained alert and defiant, tracking the movements of anyone who passed her door dot. She was thinner than she'd been 5 days ago, her cheekbones sharp with hunger and stress. But she was alive and she was unbroken. Marcus's hands clenched into fists as he fought the urge to tear the door from its hinges. Only Sarah's warning touch on his arm kept him from doing something that would destroy their careful plan. "I need to examine the patient for symptoms of respiratory infection," Sarah announced. "Equine influenza can transfer to humans in rare cases." The receptionist looked panicked. "I'll need to call." "Ma'am," Sarah's voice carried the weight of absolute authority, "this is a federal emergency. If you continue to obstruct this inspection, I'll be forced to recommend immediate facility quarantine pending full investigation. That means no one enters or leaves until every patient and animal has been examined by federal teams." The threat of quarantine, with its implications of lost revenue and negative publicity, finally broke the receptionist's resistance. She unlocked the door with trembling hands. Caitlin looked up as they entered, her expression cycling through surprise, hope, and wariness in rapid succession. Her eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Hello, Miss Morrison," Sarah said professionally. "I'm Dr. Chun, and I need to ask you some questions about your recent health history." Understanding flickered in Caitlin's green eyes. "Of course, doctor." As Sarah went through the motions of a medical examination, Marcus positioned himself between Caitlin and the receptionist, blocking the woman's view while Sarah whispered urgently, "Federal agents are moving to multiple facilities in 30 minutes. We need to get you out before security realizes what's happening." Caitlin nodded almost imperceptibly. "The horses?" "Safe for now, but we need to move." Through his earpiece, Marcus heard Torres's voice crackling with tension. "Marcus, we have a problem. Blackwood's people are moving toward Ironwood Stables. Whatever you're going to do it now." Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. If Blackwood was targeting the ranch while they were here, Emma could be in danger despite their precautions. "Change of plans," he whispered to Sarah. "We need to leave immediately." Sarah nodded and straightened, her expression professionally concerned. "I'm afraid this patient shows signs of respiratory distress that require immediate transfer to a proper medical facility. Emergency protocols mandate immediate evacuation." The receptionist's confusion was obvious. "But she's here for psychiatric evaluation, which becomes irrelevant if she's infected with a communicable disease." Sarah replied firmly, "I'm ordering immediate medical transfer under Department of Agriculture authority." The bluff was audacious and completely improvised, but the receptionist's terror of federal oversight carried them forward. Within minutes, they were escorting Caitlin through corridors toward the emergency exit, her transfer authorized by bureaucratic procedures that existed only in Sarah's imagination. As they reached the parking area, Marcus caught sight of movement near the stable complex. Several men in suits were walking among the paddocks, their attention focused on the Sullivan horses with the interest of appraisers rather than caretakers. "They're cataloging assets," Caitlin said quietly, following his gaze. "Getting ready to move everything before the authorities arrive." Marcus helped her into the veterinary truck, his protective instinct surging as he saw how thin she'd become. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing permanent," she replied, though her voice carried echoes of experiences she didn't want to describe. "Marcus, how did you—" "Later," he interrupted as Sarah started the engine. "Right now we need to get you somewhere safe." As they drove toward the compound's exit, Marcus's earpiece crackled with Torres's voice carrying news that made his blood run cold. "Marcus, Ironwood Stables is under attack. Emma's safe, but they're destroying everything. The barns are on fire." Through the truck's windshield, Marcus could see smoke rising from the direction of home, black columns against the mountain sky. That meant everything his family had built for 3 generations was burning. Caitlin's hand found his, her fingers interlacing with surprising strength. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be sorry," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the destruction of his world. "Be ready to fight back." The rescue was complete, but the war was just beginning. And this time, they had weapons that Blackwood and Wright had never faced. Before the truth, federal authority, and a woman who'd finally reclaimed her real name, Caitlin Ray Sullivan, was free. Now it was time to make her enemies pay for everything they'd stolen. The smoke rising from Ironwood Stables could be seen for miles across the mountain valley, black columns against the evening sky that marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. Marcus sat in the passenger seat of Dr. Chun's truck as they raced along winding roads toward home, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "There," Caitlin said suddenly, pointing toward a ridge that overlooked the ranch. We can see everything from up there without walking into an ambush. Sarah turned onto a logging road that Marcus had forgotten existed, her veterinary truck grinding up the steep grade toward a vantage point his grandfather had once used for hunting. Through the trees, they caught glimpses of the destruction. Below, orange flames consuming the century-old barn while uniformed men moved through the smoke like shadows dotted the ridge's crest. They stopped the truck and climbed out into air thick with smoke and the distant sound of sirens. The view of Ironwood Stables spread below them like a scene from a nightmare. The main barn was fully engulfed, its ancient timbers feeding flames that reached toward the darkening sky. The hay storage building blazed beside it, sending sparks across the ranch yard in dangerous spirals. But it was the sight of the horses that made Marcus's chest tighten with fury and despair. Thunder Canyon and the rest of the breeding stock were trapped in the main pasture, their escape routes blocked by men with trucks who seemed more interested in containment than rescue. The animals ran in frantic circles, their terror visible even from a distance as smoke and flame surrounded their world. "They're not trying to kill the horses," Caitlin observed with cold analysis. "They're hurting them." Marcus followed her gaze and realized she was right. The positioning of vehicles and men created a funnel that would drive the panicked animals toward a livestock trailer parked near the road. This wasn't just destruction, it was theft disguised as arson. "Blackwood's taking them," he said, his voice tight with rage. "He's burning everything else and stealing the horses." Through his earpiece, Rebecca Torres's voice crackled with updates from multiple locations. "Federal raids are underway at 6 facilities. We have Wright Industries executives in custody, and Blackwood's assets are being frozen pending investigation." "But Marcus, local law enforcement won't respond to calls about your ranch haze, has them convinced it's an insurance investigation." The corruption ran deeper than Marcus had imagined, even with federal agencies moving against the trafficking network. Local power structures remained loyal to the men who'd bought their influence years ago. "We have to do something," Marcus said. "I can't just watch them steal everything." "Against armed men with official backing?" Sarah shook her head. "Marcus, it's not worth your life." "Those horses are worth more than my life," Marcus replied with quiet intensity. "Thunder Canyon alone represents 4 generations of my family's work. And if they take the breeding stock, they control genetics that should belong to Caitlin." Caitlin stepped closer to the ridge's edge, her green eyes studying the chaos below with tactical precision. "How many men down there?" "Too many," Marcus said automatically. "That's not a number." Caitlin's voice carried the calm authority of someone assessing a battlefield. "I count 8 vehicles, probably 12 to 15 men. They're spread out because they're controlling a large area, which means they're vulnerable to concentrated action." Marcus stared at her, seeing something in her expression that hadn't been there before, a hardness that spoke of decisions made and accepted. "Caitlin, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking those are Sullivan horses in that pasture, and I'm tired of letting thieves profit from my grandfather's legacy." She turned to face both Marcus and Sarah, her expression resolute. "I'm going down there." "That's suicide," Sarah protested. "Maybe, but I've been running for 6 years, and I'm done running." Caitlin's hand moved to Marcus's arm, her touch electric despite the circumstances. "You saved me from that place because you saw something worth fighting for. Well, I see something worth fighting for too." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than attraction or even love. This woman standing beside him wasn't the broken victim he'd tried to rescue at the auction. She was Caitlin Ray Sullivan, granddaughter of legends, heir to a legacy of champions. And she was choosing to fight for what belonged to both of them. "Then we go together," he said simply. "Marcus, no arguments." His voice carried new authority, born from watching everything he'd built burn while men with guns smiled at the destruction. "Those are my horses, my land, my family's legacy. If we're making a stand, we make it together." Sarah looked between them, seeing something that made her nod slowly. Then we do this smartly. Dr. Chun's veterinary truck has enough authority to get close without raising immediate suspicion. And I have something in my medical kit that might help. 20 minutes later, they were driving slowly down the ranch's main driveway with Sarah at the wheel and official veterinary lights flashing. To casual observation, they appeared to be emergency responders arriving to treat injured animals exactly the kind of confusion that might provide crucial seconds of advantage. The men controlling the scene were a mixture of private security, uniforms, and sheriff's department badges, creating intentional ambiguity about their authority. But Marcus recognized the aggressive postures and coordinated movements of professionals accustomed to violence. "Animal Emergency Services," Sarah called out as they approached the command vehicle. "We have reports of horses in distress." The man who emerged from the command vehicle was built like a linebacker and carried himself with military precision. His eyes swept the veterinary truck with suspicious attention, while his hand rested casually on his sidearm. "No animals in distress here," he said firmly. "This is a crime scene investigation. You need to move along." "Sir, we have a legal obligation to respond to reports of animal welfare emergencies," Sarah replied with professional authority. "I'll need to examine the horses to verify their condition." The standoff stretched for 10 seconds while the security chief weighed his options. Behind him, Marcus could see other men herding Thunder Canyon and the mares toward the livestock trailer with increasing urgency. 5 minutes, the chief finally conceded. "Stay with my men and don't interfere with ongoing operations." As they climbed out of the truck, Marcus felt Caitlin's hand brushes briefly, a touch that somehow conveyed both farewell and promise. They were walking into a situation that could destroy them both, but they were walking into it together. Horses' distress was obvious even to untrained eyes. Smoke and flame had triggered every instinct that told them to run, but the men with vehicles had turned their natural escape routes into traps. Thunder Canyon stood at the center of the group, his magnificent head raised as he tried to shield the mares from the chaos surrounding them. "Beautiful animals," one of the security men commented as they approached the pasture. "Shame about the fire, but at least we can save the valuable ones." The casual greed in his voice made Marcus's hands clenched into fists. These men weren't even pretending to be concerned about animal welfare. They were looters taking advantage of a crisis they'd created themselves. Caitlin moved toward the fence with the fluid grace Marcus remembered from their first morning together. The horse's reaction was immediate and dramatic, heads turning, ears pricking forward, bodies shifting to orient toward her presence. "Easy, beautiful," she murmured, her voice carrying across the pasture with remarkable clarity. "I know you're scared. I know everything's wrong, but I'm here now." Thunder Canyon's response was extraordinary. The stallion moved directly toward Caitlin, despite the chaos around him, his dark eyes fixed on her face with unmistakable recognition. The mares followed, creating a living barrier between themselves and the men who'd been herding them. "Ma'am, you need to step back," one of the security men ordered. "These animals are dangerous in their current state." Caitlin ignored him completely. Her attention remained focused on Thunder Canyon as she reached through the fence to touch his face. The stallion pressed against her palm with obvious relief, his entire body relaxing for the first time since the crisis began. "They know you," Marcus said quietly, understanding flooding through him. "They know my grandfather's bloodline," Caitlin replied. "Sullivan horses have been bred for intelligence and loyalty for 4 generations. They recognize family." The security men were growing agitated by the horses' behavior. Animals that had been easy to control suddenly became stubborn and uncooperative, responding to Caitlin's presence instead of the pressure being applied by their captors. "That's enough," the security chief announced, approaching with obvious irritation. "Miss, you need to move away from the fence immediately." "Actually," said a new voice from behind them, She needs to stay exactly where she is. Everyone turned to see Rebecca Torres walking toward them with a folder of documents and an expression of professional satisfaction. Behind her, 4 men in FBI jackets emerged from vehicles that had approached with surprising stealth. "Rebecca Torres, Civil Rights Legal Foundation," she announced, presenting credentials to the stunned security chief. "These gentlemen are federal agents executing warrants related to an ongoing trafficking investigation." The transformation was instantaneous. Professional confidence dissolved into nervous uncertainty as the security men realized they'd walked into a federal operation. Radio chatter erupted as supervisors tried to understand how their carefully planned theft had become a law enforcement nightmare. "Ma'am, we're operating under county authority," the security chief began. "County authority that's been superseded by federal warrants," Torres interrupted smoothly. "Gentlemen, you're all potential witnesses in a trafficking investigation. I suggest you cooperate fully with federal agents." As FBI agents moved to secure the scene, Marcus found himself standing beside Caitlin at the pasture fence, watching Thunder Canyon and the Mares settle into calm awareness that their ordeal was ending. "How does it feel?" he asked quietly. "How does what feel?" "Getting your horses back, your real name, your grandfather's legacy." Caitlin was quiet for a long moment, her hand still resting on Thunder Canyon's neck. "Like coming home," she said. "Finally, like finding the part of myself I thought was lost forever." Marcus nodded, understanding the feeling completely. Watching her with the horses, seeing the recognition and trust between them, he realized that this was what he'd sensed from the beginning. She belonged here not because he'd bought her, but because this was where she was always meant to be. "The ranch will need rebuilding," he said. "Yes, it will. It'll take years to restore everything we've lost. Probably." Marcus turned to face her fully, seeing his own hopes reflected in her green eyes. "I can't pay you what the horses are worth. Can't offer you anything but hard work and uncertainty." Caitlin's smile was the first completely joyful expression he'd seen from her. "Marcus Whitfield," she said, "are you offering me a partnership?" "I'm offering you whatever you want. Partnership, employment, marriage, friendship, whatever feels right to you." "What feels right," Caitlin said, stepping closer until they were almost touching, "is spending the rest of my life working beside someone who sees horses the way I do. Someone who values legacy over profit and courage over safety." As if responding to their conversation, Thunder Canyon whinnied softly, the sound carrying across the ranch yard like a blessing. The other horses answered, their voices joining in harmony that spoke of homecoming and new beginnings. "I love you," Marcus said simply. "I love you too," Caitlin replied. "And I think my grandfather would have approved." 6 months later, Ironwood Stables was rising from its ashes with new buildings and ancient bloodlines. The Sullivan genetics had been restored to their rightful owner, and the Whitfield-Sullivan partnership was producing champions that honored both family legacies. Ezra Blackwood and Daniel Wright were serving federal sentences for trafficking and fraud. Sheriff Hayes had been removed from office and faced his own criminal charges. The network of corruption that had operated for years was finally exposed to the light. But none of that mattered as much as the morning Marcus woke to find Caitlin already in the barn, working with a colt whose bloodline traced back to both their grandfather's dreams. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd found her purpose, her auburn hair catching the early light as she guided the young horse through exercises that would prepare him for championships. "Beautiful morning," Marcus said as he joined her in the training ring. "Perfect morning," Caitlin agreed, her green eyes bright with contentment. Born to ride mornings. And watching her work with the horse that represented their shared future, Marcus knew she was right. Some people were born to run, others born to fight, still others born to lead. Caitlin Ray Sullivan had been born to ride not just horses, but the storm itself, until she found the place where she belonged. and the person meant to ride beside her, the wild girl they'd mocked at auction, had come home at last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.